From Europe, we now move to the Pacific, and we're particularly going to talk about the time period right before the assault on Japan itself. In the first half of 1942 was marked by a lot of Japanese advances. The world was astonished at how quickly they were making progress. For example, within 2 months of Pearl Harbor, Japan controlled the entirety of the British owned Malay Peninsula with its great naval base in Singapore. 3 weeks later, the Japanese are going to overrun the Netherlands East Indies. Early in May, Great Britain is actually going to retreat from Burma into India. Japanese bases that had been established to the north on Dutch-owned New Guinea and to the east in the Bismarck and Solomon Islands. Now, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, American and Filipino troops are going to heroically try to defend the Philippine Islands until the last man could be spent. At the order of President Roosevelt, MacArthur transfers his headquarters from the Philippines to Australia in February of 1942, but his troops that remained there are going to fight until May of that year. Japanese treatment of these troops is brutal and humane. It's been estimated that 18,000 of the 72,000 GIs and Filipinos that were defending the Philippines died along a 60-mile forced march to prison camps. This forced march was known as the Bataan Death March. Soon after Japan secured the Philippines, its forces are going to try to move out into the American-owned Aleutian Islands, a chain of islands off of the Alaskan Peninsula. American forces will ultimately oust them in the spring of 1943. By the late summer of 1942, the Japanese occupied 1 million square miles in their triumphant advance, but that's where it ended. Their retreat was humiliating and it was costly, both in lives and material resources. In April of 1942, American airplanes, commanded by James Doolittle, would drop tons of bombs on Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kobe. This was the first bombing of the Japanese home islands. A few weeks later, American and naval air forces in the Coral Sea stopped an invading force aimed towards Australia to the west. The first real defeat for Japan took place in June of 1942, with a rout of a strong Japanese naval force proceeding towards the island of Midway, to the northwest of Hawaii. In August of 1942, the Allies would launch their counteroffensive in earnest when American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. For the next 2 years, U.S. Marines would hop from island to island, gradually but at great cost of lives, pushing the Japanese back towards their home islands. From the Solomons, they moved to the Marshalls, the British-owned Gilberts, and the Carolines and the Marianas. The Allies took Guam in August of 1944, and they were proceeding to prepare for the reconquest of the Philippine Islands. In the spring of 1944, American airplane factories are beginning to produce B-29 Superfortresses, which were designed for long flights with heavy bomb loads. Based in airfields in China, which Chinese had built without tools, or almost without tools, these airplanes effectively destroyed the industrial centers of Japan. While the Allied forces are moving northward and westward across the islands of the Pacific, ever closer to Japan, the Chinese would keep up a resistance against Japanese occupation of their homeland. They were heartened by an increasing support from American air forces in China, commanded by a man named Claire Chennault, and by the campaign of the Chinese and American troops to reopen the Burma Road, a highway that was first used in 1938 to carry supplies and troops, and was captured by Japanese forces during the war. At the same time, forces of various countries within the British Commonwealth of Nations were gradually clearing the Japanese out of Burma.